Estamos muy contentos de poder realizar esta actividad en la Universidad de Salvador. Agradecemos muchísimo a la Universidad, Facultad de Filosofía, Letras y Estudios Orientales, por haber organizado la actividad, habernos recibido. Y le agradecemos también al doctor Edwin Bryant, que está acá presente, que estuvo presente durante todo el mes de febrero en Argentina, realizando distintas actividades. Gracias también al trabajo de Laura Basile, que organizó toda la avenida en Bryant acá al país. Edwin actualmente trabaja en la Universidad de Rutgers, en el departamento de religiones, profesor de sánscrito, de filosofía y religiones de la India. Anteriormente fue profesor en la Universidad de Harvard y realizó sus estudios de grado y de doctorado en la Universidad de Columbia en Estados Unidos. Así que es un especialista en el área. Posiblemente muchos de nosotros estamos por sus trabajos relacionados con el yoga, una traducción comentada, una retoma de los comentarios antiguos del Yoga Sutra, una obra fundamental de yoga. También tiene trabajos sobre Bhagavata Purana, tiene una traducción del capítulo 10 de Bhagavata Purana, donde se recogen las ideas de Krishna, el libro Monistic. Y otros trabajos también numerosos y sumamente importantes, libros ideológicos, son muy recomendados. Así que quienes estudiamos estos temas hemos recurrido a la literatura que produce Edwin Bryant y sabemos entonces que es realmente un honor por compartir este momento, por escucharlo. Y actualmente se encuentra trabajando en dos proyectos. Simplemente que retrase el momento de darle la palabra a él, pero me parece que escucharlo también es lindo en el contexto de saber quién es y saber a qué se dedica. Uno de los proyectos en los que está trabajando es una traducción sobre el Bhagavad Gita, donde retoma 6 comentarios también tradicionales del Bhagavad Gita. 3 de esos comentarios pertenecen a la tradición advaita y otros 3 a distintas ramas de tradición advaita. Uno es no dualismo y otro es dualismo. Son 6 comentarios y junto con su traducción de Bhagavad Gita brinda la traducción de pasajes seleccionados de 6 comentarios. Para que nosotros podamos leer el texto y entender cómo ese texto fue comentado, comprendido y explicado en la misma tradición en la que se produjo. Y otro de los proyectos está relacionado con la charla que vamos a escuchar hoy, que es una investigación acerca de la concepción de lo divino con forma, que se distingue esta concepción de lo divino como un absoluto sin forma, sin cualidad. Es un trabajo con una parte deconstructivo, en donde Edwin analiza argumentos tópicos que han entendido la concepción de lo divino absoluto sin forma, y cuestiona esos argumentos para luego analizar a su vez argumentos a favor de la concepción de lo divino con forma, con lo cual además de un aspecto deconstructivo tiene un aspecto constructivo. Con lo cual se trata de un trabajo filosófico y teológico. Estamos a la espera de este trabajo, a leerlo como hemos leído sus trabajos, y bueno, le agradecemos a Edwin que hoy nos comparta los anticipos de ese libro que próximamente va a publicar. Por último, les agradezco a todos ustedes presentes por escucharlo a Edwin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gabriel, for inviting me to the university. And sorry I don't speak Spanish. I'm going to try in the future. I love Argentina, and I keep saying, I was born in Italy, so my mother language, lingua materna, was Italian, and I spent many years in India. So Argentina is sort of like a blend between Italy and India. it has the culture of Italy, this urban culture, Italy and Spain, of course. But the countryside has a little India about it, a little chaos and color. And so it's a very interesting blend, for me, my sensitive. So,
Perdón, parte de la dinámica de esta charla es que Edwin va a hablar, yo lo voy a traducir. Si mi traducción resulta que entorpece la comprensión, porque todos entienden perfectamente el inglés de Edwin, entonces me avisan y yo dejo de traducir o dejamos hablar al tiempo. Si no, vamos a ir haciendo un ping-pong donde él habla y yo traduzco. De pronto, lo que Edwin acaba de decir es que estamos contentos de estar acá y de que para él Argentina es un país muy querido, porque él nació en Italia y su lengua materna es el italiano, y siempre dice que Argentina, además que vivió muchos años en India, y siempre dice que para él Argentina es como una mezcla de Italia y la India, que su aspecto urbano le recuerda mucho a Italia, en España, y el aspecto menos urbano le hace recordar un poco el caos y el color de la India.
it is actually, if you were blindfolded and you're parachuted into Buenos Aires, right, on the plane, and you open it, you think you're in Italy. You think you're in an Italian city. It depends where you land, okay. Okay, so, thank you. So yeah, I'm here. It's normally I wouldn't be here. I'd be teaching at this time of year, but I have a sabbatical for a whole year. So in my university, every 6 years, you get a 1 year sabbatical. So this is my 1 year. Or every 3 years you get half, or you can wait and 6 years you get a full year. So that's why I'm here. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And on my sabbatical, I'm working on this book called well, I started calling it the defense of a godless form, philosophical defense. But then I thought that sounds a little bit like apologetics, so I changed the title to Encountering a Godless Form, the philosophical rationale for positing a God with form.
Entonces, Edwin nos explica que por lo general él estaría enseñando en esta época del año, pero este año tiene un año sabático, porque cada 6 años se otorgan un año completo sabático o cada 3 y medio años sabático. Entonces, puede estar acá por eso, en esta época del año, y dice que es un gran placer para él. Y en este año sabático, él está trabajando en un libro que inicialmente pensaba que se iba a titular en defensa de Dios con forma, pero luego le pareció un poco apologético, ético, entonces decidió modificarlo para que se titule Un encuentro con Dios con forma.
I'm actually a closet apologist, but I won't, that's another story. So we'll start at the end of the journey. I was motivated, triggered to do this project for 2 main reasons. One was the prioritization of monism in representations of Hinduism, both in the comparative mystical literature, right? There's a whole now body of there's a whole aspect of Islamic religion that deals with mysticism, and obviously, if you're looking for comparative mysticism, you're looking for some easy to find common denominator. And so the monistic traditions of India lend themselves very well to this common, William James, post-William James quest, some common mystical experience, right? One way of trying to validate the reality of mystical experience is to suggest that it is common to all mystical traditions, and to do that you have to be pretty selective. You have to find, and typically monistic expressions of mystical experiences are going to be those that are commonly found. So that was one thing that sort of triggered my mild irritation, or certainly my intellect, triggered a need for an intellectual analysis of this. Why is it that monism is prioritized rather than the monotheistic traditions where the mystical experiences of God with form. Why is that totally and utterly neglected in Western discussions of mysticism? So that was one reason for this project. And by the way, again, in the third chapter of the Tantra Yoga Sutra, there's a whole chapter on siddhis, mystic powers. And Gabriel has a mystic power. He doesn't walk on water, he doesn't fly, but he has an incredible memory. And I don't know how he does.
Edwin nos cuenta que una de las razones que motivó su interés y que le hizo pensar que había una necesidad de un análisis intelectual de esta cuestión, que lo que es su libro, es, en primer lugar, la priorización que se da a mismo, a la concepción monista, en la representación del hinduismo que se hace en Occidente y en general en la literatura relativa a los estudios de la mística. Y hay un área de religioso que aborda los estudios de la mística y, por lo general, en ese área, el hinduismo es representado como, ¿sí? En general, cuando se quiere hacer un estudio relativo al misticismo, es un estudio comparativo y para encontrar un denominador común a las distintas tradiciones místicas, el monismo es un elemento, digamos, de fácil comparación, tanto respecto a la India como de las occidentales, sobre todo en los estudios posteriores a William James, que retoman la noción de la experiencia mística. El objetivo es validar la realidad de la experiencia. Entonces él se pregunta por qué se prioriza esta representación del hinduismo y por qué se descuida la representación que incluye las tradiciones monoteístas de la India que conciben a Dios como forma. También son importantes en el
So that was one reason. And if there's a motive to scholarship, even if it's a benevolent motive, like William James's motive, he wants to say that there is something genuinely spiritual that's not reducible to materialism. So from a spiritualist or a theistic point of view, that's a benevolent motive, but it's still a motive. And therefore, if you have a motive, then you're going to be selective. You're going to be selective about what accommodates your motive and what doesn't. So what William Jones and the lineage that comes after that in comparative mysticism found conducive to their agenda was the monistic experience. So I'm just sort of reaffirming what I just said. So that was one trigger. The other.
Entonces, Edwin nos cuenta que siempre que hay un motivo en los estudios académicos, por más que ese motivo sea benevolente, como era el caso de William James, que buscaba validar la realidad de las experiencias místicas que transmiten las religiosas, aún así, si hay un motivo, un trabajo académico, va a ser selectivo y va a buscar o va a elegir aquel material que se acomoda a su motivo, va a descartar en alguna medida el material que no se ajusta a ese motivo. Y los materiales que se ajustan, el motivo que busca encontrar un elemento común en las tradiciones místicas es justamente el monismo, ¿sí? De las distintas tradiciones, sea de la India o de
By the way, that doesn't describe Hindu visions of divinity. I remember reading in States the Catholic mystical claims to visions of the Virgin Mary, for example, are considered to be rustic and primitive and therefore not really suitable material for this comparative mysticism project. Not just the Indian deities that are relegated to the realm of mythology or cultural superimposition, it's also Catholic visions. So we're all in this together, if there's any Catholic stuff.
Y esto no solo se aplica, esta selectividad no solo se aplica a los estudios relativos al hinduismo, sino que él también tiene presente a William Stace, que es otro estudioso del siglo XX, que importantes sobre la experiencia mística y los elementos comunes. Y William Seix deja de lado, por ejemplo, las experiencias visionarias de los cristianos de la Virgen María, que considera que estas no son experiencias que pueden, digamos, aportar al estudio del comparativo de las tradiciones místicas. Y también privilegia el monismo dentro de las experiencias religiosas cristianas.
Is that clear? So in other words, a genuine mystical experience, according to this lens, is formless, qualityless, just kind of some kind of transmental experience of pure consciousness or objectless consciousness. That is a genuine mystical experience. If you start talking about visions of Shiva, visions of Narayana, visions of the Virgin Mary, that is considered a cultural superimposition. Well, how about, who says, how about we challenge that? How about we look for the philosophical underpinnings of that type of a straitjacketing of the data? Sorry, sounded like I was shouting.
Entonces, desde esta perspectiva, la privilegia el monismo, ¿no? De los estudios de la mística comparativos, de esa perspectiva, desde esa lente, una experiencia mística genuina debe ser sin forma, sin cualidad, transmental y propia de una conciencia sin un objeto. Por el contrario, aquellas experiencias que implican una visión de Shiva, de Narayana o ya sea de la Virgen María, no son adecuadas, no representan las experiencias genuinas. Entonces, el análisis que lleva adelante Edwin es estudiar los supuestos filosóficos que constituyen este abordaje que hacen esta clase de afirmación.
The other reason is that if you go to India, some India then you look at Hinduism, right? Hinduism is essentially deity worship, it's temple worship. So there are the major religious expressions of Hinduism over the last 2,000 years of Vaishnava in multiple streams, Shaiva in multiple streams, and Shakta also in multiple streams, with less literature associated with the Shakta traditions. And each of these streams has centuries of very sophisticated theologies, of philosophical, philosophy being harnessed in the construction of these theologies associated with these traditions. But how come none of that gets represented in Western? If you look at a book of Indian philosophy, you're not going to find Vaishnava theology. You're not going to find Shaiva. So there's sort of a banishment editing of what constitutes theology. You're going to see a chapter on Buddhism, a chapter on Jainism, a chapter on the materialists, and a chapter on the 6 schools of Indian philosophy. Where is Vaishnavism? Where are the Shaiva tradition? Who created this construct and why? So this was our motive in going into this project. Why this editing? Why this, why this clinical sort of banishment of the mainstream, the normative traditions of India, which are Shaiva and Vaishnava? So that was something that seemed like, why hasn't anybody looked at this before? Why isn't this obvious? That's a big problem here.
Si uno viaja a India, y seguramente muchos de ustedes han viajado, se van a dar cuenta, o nos damos cuenta que el hinduismo es principalmente la adoración, el culto a deidades, a una adoración que se da en el contexto de los templos. Y esta adoración, estas expresiones religiosas, se dan en el contexto de las tradiciones Vaishnava, Shaiva y también Shakta, aunque las tradiciones Shakta están menos representadas en su propia naturaleza, su propia literatura. Ahora, estas distintas tradiciones Vaishnava, Shaiva y Shakta, cada una de ellas múltiple en sí misma, tienen siglos de desarrollo sofisticado, filosófico y teológico, y desarrollo teológico con fundamentos, es decir, la construcción filosófica de la teología. Pero, en general, ninguno de estos elementos son representados en la literatura occidental, los libros occidentales acerca de la filosofía de la India. Si uno agarra un libro occidental sobre filosofía de la India, encuentra un capítulo sobre budismo, un capítulo sobre hinduismo, un capítulo sobre materialismo, capítulos sobre las 6 escuelas principales o darshanas de la filosofía de la India, pero no encuentra ninguna diferencia detallada a las tradiciones Shaiva, Vaishnava, Shakta. Entonces la pregunta que se hace Edwin y que motiva su investigación es quién y por qué se realiza este trabajo de edición, este proyecto de eliminación clínica de estas corrientes mainstream, es decir, principales de las tradiciones, sobre todo Shaivas y Vaishnavas, en la representación occidental del pensamiento.
So the answer, of course, is that these traditions, God has a form. So then the question became, well, why this resistance to godly form? And the answer to that, of course, is not so much in Hinduism, but it's in the colonial period. It's a missionary representations of Hinduism, colonial responses to Hinduism, and therefore, so that was where this sort of this kind of what constitutes rational Hinduism that emerges from colonial discourse and missionary discourse. So then, okay, so then we have to follow that trail. Where does this aversion or resistance or philosophical opposition to the notion of God with form, where does that come from? So if you trace that genealogy back, you're going to have to end up with the Old Testament, and then well, that's enough for now.
La respuesta a esta pregunta es que para estas tradiciones Dios tiene una forma. Entonces, hay una nueva pregunta que es ¿por qué esta representación, esta aversión, esta resistencia o esta oposición a esta concepción de lo divino como forma? Y si uno realiza una genealogía sobre estas representaciones, encuentra en la raíz el colonialismo y las representaciones que misioneros europeos que vienen de la India, dan de la India cuando llegan a la India durante la época colonial. Y tiene que ver también con el discurso colonial acerca de qué es el hinduismo racional. Y por otra parte, bueno, cuando se realiza esta genealogía también se llega al Antiguo Testamento.
So I had to step out of my box. Part of my project is to encourage Abrahamic traditions and those that are coming from, that come from theologies emerging from the Abrahamic traditions. Part of my project is to invite them to step out of their box, but I also had to step out of my box, and which is, massively informed by Hinduism the last 45 years of my life. So there is no question, and I'm not a scholar of the Old Testament, but I just totally immersed myself for 2 months in secondary sources, everything dealing with the depiction of God in the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is an anthropomorphic God. Walks, who talks, who communicates, gets angry, who's highly emotional, overwhelming. There is nowhere that some prophets can see and some can't see, and if you can't see, it's not because God doesn't have a form, but it's dangerous to see the form, and human mental cognitive capacities can't bear the sight of Yahweh. There is no question that Yahweh in the Old Testament is an anthropomorphic deity, and no, as far as I have found nothing, and no serious scholarship, and there's numerous books. I'd like to read one quote to you from the most recent book, 2022, on, it is called, I can't remember, there's something about book form, but shall I read it?
Well, the nature
Yeah.
Entonces Edwin se dedicó al estudio, a ver dónde, una línea, muy bien. Él nos comenta que tuvo que correrse de su esquema mental, así de su caja, porque esta caja, su esquema mental, ha sido informado por los últimos 45 años por la filosofía de la India, y se tuvo que correr de ese esquema porque se sumergió en los estudios relativos al Antiguo Testamento, y así como todo esto, su proyecto también fomenta a los especialistas en las tradiciones abrahámicas, en la teología abrámica, a correrse un poco de su esquema para poder entrar en diálogo con los esquemas propios del hinduismo. Pero a raíz de su estudio, fundamentalmente de las fuentes secundarias que tratan sobre el Antiguo Testamento, se concluye que no hay ninguna duda de que Yahvé, el Dios del Antiguo Testamento, que es un Dios antropomórfico, que habla, que tiene respuestas emocionales a los sucesos, que se enoja, que si los religiosos no lo pueden ver, ya sea porque es muy peligroso verlo o porque sus facultades no son capaces de captar la naturaleza de lo divino, pero no había duda de que esa naturaleza es común. Y él me quiere citar un pasaje de un libro publicado en el año pasado, 2022, cuyo título es algo así como Dios.
And it's just a book about just going through the entire Bible, meticulously extracting all the reference to God's limbs, his eyes, his nose, its mouth. Nowhere does it in the Bible does it say that you should read these allegorically. We'll get to that in a minute. That's Philo. That's Philo centuries later. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that these anthropomorphic references should not be taken literally. So I just read you a quote from there's a number of books in the last 10 years seems to have emerged as a topic now in the study of religion. But this is by, I forget its name, it's a Greek Strauss, something like that, but Francesca. And she's an atheist, right? She's basically arguing there is no question that the God in the Bible is anthropomorphic, but her agenda isn't to promote some concept of God. Her agenda is to show that it's a human construct, that humans just their humanity onto God, right? So it's an anthropomorphic projection, like Xenophanes said, well, if horses could write, then God would be a horse. So, so therefore her agenda is to just ridicule religion, but she's very, very clear that the God of the Old Testament, is humanoid. And this is to me, it was a very poignant statement. She couldn't understand, why is everybody not reading the Bible literally? And then this is her quote. And then it suddenly dawned on me, everyone else in the room, my theology professor including, was censoring the Bible, sanitizing its deity of any earthly or unsettling characteristics, anthropomorphic characteristics. I was disappointed by them, and disappointed for them. Stripping away the theological veneer of centuries of Jewish and Christian piety, her book wants to get back to how God is actually presented in the Old Testament. Again, Monisms are not religious by any means. She's an atheist. So that was the starting point. I thought, interesting. Okay, where do we go from here?
Entonces este libro es un estudio de toda la Biblia que recoge todas las referencias a Dios, sobre su boca, sobre sus acciones, y afirma que en ningún lado se afirma que hay que leer esas referencias de manera alegórica o no literal. Esto es el resultado de una lectura posterior que se puede atribuir a Filón de Alejandría en el siglo I después de Cristo. Y esta autora es una autora que es atea, con lo cual su agenda no es defender una concepción de lo que vimos como forma, sino mostrar que justamente la idea de lo divino, por ser antropomórfica, es una construcción cultural, social, que Edwin retoma en la figura de Genófanes. Antiguamente quien habría afirmado que si los caballos pudieran formarse una representación de lo divino, ya también semejante a un caballo. Entonces esta autora, que no recuerda ahora su nombre, afirma que no hay duda de que Dios del Antiguo Testamento sea antropomórfico. Y leyó la cita en bien. Entonces la autora dice, y luego, de manera súbita, me cayó la ficha. Todo el mundo, todos los presentes en el bien, clase, su profesor de teología incluido, estaban censurando la Biblia, sanitizando las características deístas o teístas, mitológicas, terrenales o problemáticas de lo divino. Estaba gracias, desilusionado por ellos y de ellos. Estaban quitando toda la arena teológica de siglos de teología cristiana y judía. ¿No? Sí, así. Estaba muy sorprendida de que no aceptan la caracterización antropomórfica de lo divino.
Se non si sa la parola spagnola, si prende l'italiano, si sa.
Perché cosa in italiano?
70% va bene. 30% disastro. So, so then the journey, I'm going to have to obviously give you a very edited version. So then the journey, and the rabbis had no problem with this for centuries. Rabbinic, Talmudic interpretation were very comfortable with the idea of an African God. There's more genres of literature, mainstream, normative, rabbinical, as well as mystical, talking about God. You know, Ezekiel, a lot is based on the vision of Ezekiel on the throne, right? Like the Bible doesn't, it just said the appearance of a man on the throne. The various dramatic instances in the Old Testament, God appears to the Jews at parting of the Red Sea. Various prophets see God. Abraham sees him. Moses sees him. Sometimes you can't see him. But basically, the rabbinic tradition has had no problem with an anthropomorphic God for centuries. So, so the journey really starts with early Christian, the early church fathers. And we'll then say something about that.
Y es interesante que la tradición rabínica durante mucho tiempo no tuvo problemas con esta caracterización antropomórfica de lo divino en el Antiguo Testamento. Una tradición normativa, incluso mística, ligada al Talmud, que retoman, por ejemplo, las visiones de los profetas de Ezequiel, que habla de un hombre sentado en un trono, de distintas instancias dramáticas que nos dice la Biblia acerca de estos profetas que pueden ver a Dios. Entonces no es esta la línea, digamos, por la cual hay que comenzar, sino más bien por las representaciones tempranas de lo divino de la mano de los padres de la Iglesia temprana.
So the first 100 years of Christianity, most Christians, followed the rabbinic example, and they accepted a God with form. It's only in the early church fathers you see in Tertullian, even Tertullian accepts the Stoic notion of a corporeal God. That's a story. But we have to understand a little bit about the Near Eastern context. It's a Greek-speaking context, so it's Greek culture. And obviously, Christianity is emerging in this, sophisticated Greek milieu, and the Christians are scorned by Greek philosophers as rustics, as simpletons, as people who believe, their God is sitting on a throne. So they're being ridiculed, and obviously, from their midst, there are going to be intellectuals, and the dharma, if we can use a Sanskrit term, the dharma, the duty of an intellectual is of a theologian. What's the duty of a theologian? The duty of a theologian is to use the currents of philosophy and intellectual thought of the day and use that in support of divine revelation. That's what theology is. And it's one way of thinking of theology, is that you're using all of the intellectual tools of your time and concepts of your time, but you're using them in defense of divine revelation. That's why it's not philosophy, because you start off with an a priori, and philosophy is not supposed to start off with an a priori. Of course it does, but theology has a more obvious a priori, which is revelation. But what theology does then is take philosophy, but use it in the defense of theological truth claims. So the early church fathers, amongst them, right, are probably getting fed up, right, with this representation of Christianity as primitive, as rustic, as uneducated. And we have statements. It's been great fun collecting these statements of Greek, what was his name, Celtus. Some of the things he said about Christianity are quite entertaining. I can read you some. So therefore, there needs to be an intellectual response to the opponents, and not just that, but part of that is an intellectual, you need to construct a theology, an intellectually robust, not to prove your scripture, but to show it has philosophical validity. Show that it can stand its ground as good as anything else, especially if you can't prove anything. But at least you can show that your truth claims have some kind of philosophical validity to them.
Y en los primeros siglos, los cristianos adherían a los ejemplos rabínicos de los que antes comentaba Edwin. Pero lo cierto es que el cristianismo surge en un milieu, en un torno intelectual, evidentemente griego, deudor de la filosofía griega, incluso un pensador cristiano antiguo como Tertuliano, acepta la noción estoica de Dios corpóreo, pero ese, digamos, es otro tema que no vamos a abordar. Y como el pensamiento cristiano emerge en este entorno intelectual griego, estos pensadores estaban siendo atacados, ridiculizados, caracterizados como primitivos por los pensadores, por los filósofos griegos. Y su deber, entonces, si podemos utilizar el término dharma para caracterizar a los teólogos cristianos antiguos, dharma consiste en brindar un cuerpo racional, intelectual, que haga que su discurso teológico sea robusto y que en alguna medida muestre que es consistente y válido. No se trata de demostrar, porque en teología no puede haber demostración, pero sí demostrar que su discurso teológico se sustenta sobre bases racionales y sólidas. Entonces, ¿cómo podían hacer esto? Bueno, recurrieron a las herramientas, conceptos y las corrientes filosóficas de su tiempo en defensa de su teología. A diferencia de la filosofía, o por lo menos de lo que la filosofía pretendía ser, la teología comienza de un a priori, que es el a priori que brinda la revelación. La filosofía pretendía comenzar sin un a priori, sino comenzar a partir de problemas para indagar, pero a veces siempre comencemos con algunos supuestos en nuestro pensamiento, ya sea teológico o filosófico, pero la teología pone de manifiesto sus a priori teológicos, que son la revelación, de manera abierta, ¿no? Entonces, Edwin también comentaba, por ejemplo, la figura de Celso, que tiene su texto contra la verdad, ¿no? En truth against the final self.
You get it from Oregon, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Que nos llega a través de Orígenes, que discute a Celso. Y ahí vemos un discurso encarnizado de un filósofo griego.
Christians are asses and donkeys.
Que son asnos y burros los teólogos cristianos desde el punto de vista de los
They have no philosophy. Ask them any philosophical question, they run away and say, "Oh, God can do anything." This is Celsus. So Christians had to somehow deal with this. Now, the categories that were dominant in the Near East then would have been Platonic categories, because Aristotle's God is not very useful for Christianity. Aristotle's God, right, comes from how do you explain motion, essentially? How do you explain motion in the universe? So there has to be something causing motion, and that cause of motion has to be eternal, because motion is eternal, right? There's no beginning of the universe, there's no reason to suppose the universe had a beginning. So the universe is eternal, so it's eternally moving, so there has to be an eternal mover, and that eternal mover can be, it cannot change, because anything that changes is not eternal by definition. If something changes, then it's not what it was. And so therefore Aristotle God is, he can't even be aware of the universe. Because if he's aware of the universe, then his awareness as the universe changes, his awareness changes along with it. So in order to immunize his prime mover from any change whatsoever, this sounds like Sanskrit philosophy, by the way, of ancient India, then Aristotle's prime mover is not, what does he do then? He just self-contemplates, right? He has to be perfect. So what's he going to contemplate if he's perfect? Well, only himself. So he contemplates himself, and he cannot be aware of the universe. There's no good brain to him, because he's not even aware of you. So that's not very helpful if you are a biblical theologian or a Christian theologian and you want a God who intervenes and intercedes and hears prayers. So Aristotle God was not much use, but the Platonic categories were. So we find that really it's the Platonic, the idea, the realm of the form, especially the realm of the the form of the good. But the common denominator, and this is the most important point. The most important point, so I'll keep it suspended and get back to it.
Los pensadores griegos estimaban de estos pensadores cristianos que ellos no tenían una filosofía y que si se hacía preguntas salían corriendo y afirmaban que Dios podía hacer cualquier cosa. Y entonces en el estudio, Edwin Bryant, Dr. Bryant, ve que Dr. Bryant ve que las categorías que las categorías que resultan más fructíferas para la teología cristiana son platónicas, porque verdaderamente la concepción aristotélica de lo divino no resulta muy útil. ¿Sí? Aristóteles concibe a lo divino como un motor inmóvil, y el primer motor inmóvil, y verdaderamente lo postula para dar una explicación del movimiento, la causa, porque de hecho el universo aristotélico es eterno, el universo aristotélico es en eterno movimiento, por lo tanto tiene que haber una causa primera de ese movimiento que a su vez no se mueva, porque si no tiene que haber una causa más allá de ese Dios que se mueve, por lo tanto Dios es un motor, pero es inmóvil. Y al ser inmóvil no puede estar sujeto a cambio, porque si estuviera sujeto a cambio, ya dijimos, estaría una causa que lo explique. Entonces, dado que no puede cambiar, tampoco puede ser consciente de este universo que depende de él, porque si era consciente de su universo, su conciencia cambiaría. Entonces, ¿en qué consiste la actividad? Simplemente en pensar su propio pensamiento o autoconceptar. Edwin dice, me recuerda a la filosofía sánscrita antigua de la época. Con lo cual, esta concepción técnica de lo divino no fue muy útil para los pensadores cristianos antiguos, porque esta concepción de lo divino no permite explicar un Dios que intercede, que interviene, que responde a las plegarias de los. Entonces, la concepción platónica, con un puntito de las ideas, fue mucho más productiva, y hay un denominador común al cual Edwin ahora va a hacer referencia.
Anyway, let's not get into Plato because his idea of God is vague and not systematic, and I'm going to offend my friend Gabriel Martino saying that. But here's the point. For Plato or for Aristotle, all form is necessarily material. Form is a material compound. So therefore, if something has a form and it's a compound, it cannot be eternal, because you can separate the bits of the compound, and now you don't have the original form. Say the table, right? It sounds like Nagarjuna Buddhism. You can take, if you have a table, and you think, oh, I have a table, but you can separate the legs, and now what, you don't have a table anymore. And then you can separate, break up the top, and so on. So therefore, form is important, because this is where Indian theologies of form are going to question. Why do you assume that form is material? Well, that's the end of the story. But for now, therefore, if God is to be an eternal being, God cannot have it. Okay, why? Because form is a compound, and the compound can be separated, and if it can be separated, you can't talk about an eternal God then, with an eternal body, because there are no eternal bodies. All bodies are necessarily reducible into their components. So that's one of the main arguments. There's many other arguments, but we don't have time to get into them unless you're interested. So therefore, this Christian notion of an anthropomorphic God is highly unphilosophical for this in this Greek milieu. You've got to jettison your anthropomorphic God of the Old Testament if you want to present yourself as a philosophically sophisticated member of Near Eastern culture in the 2nd century of the Common Era.
Bueno, entonces no nos vamos a meter en Platón, dice Edwin, pero el común denominador es que si concebimos a algo con una forma corpórea, esto es necesariamente material y necesariamente un compuesto. Si es un compuesto, esto que tiene forma corpórea, entonces puede ser compuesto en sus partes constitutivas. Entonces no se puede asumir desde esta perspectiva que Dios tiene una forma corpórea. Se asume que Dios tiene una forma corpórea, como habían dicho los pensadores cristianos antiguos, desde la perspectiva de la filosofía griega, cierta católica y aristotélica. Entonces no se trata de una idea filosófica que pueda sustentar una teología.
Should I just read you just quickly, or is it boring? Boring? Okay, quickly, and then we'll move into the early church fathers. Okay, here are the 10 presuppositions shared by Plato and Aristotle and not so much the Stoics. Number 1, anything that's perceivable or sensible that your senses can contact is composed of matter. That's a presumption that it does not seem to be challenged by Greek thinkers. It is going to be challenged by Vaishnava thinkers. But for our story, anything that's perceivable, that object is a body, it is necessarily composed of matter. You cannot see soul, you can only see matter. Presumption number 1. Presupposition number 1.
Entonces, Edwin va a enumerar
Foundational truth, sorry.
Una serie de verdades fundacionales o de presupuestos, y el primero es que si hay algo que se percibe, entonces esto que se puede percibir debe ser un cuerpo. Y si es un cuerpo, dado que el alma no se puede percibir, tiene que estar compuesto por materia.
Number 2, I said this already. All bodies and forms are composed of compositions and therefore are reducible to their parts and therefore they're not eternal. Presupposition number 2. Foundational truth number 2.
El presupuesto número 2 es que todo cuerpo es reductible a sus partes constitutivas.
Number 3, forms require extension in space. But God must be infinite. So therefore, if you have a form, you're limited. You're limited by extension. And that's not suitable. That will not do for an infinite God.
La tercera es que la forma corpórea tiene una extensión en el espacio y por lo tanto no es adecuada para lo divino porque no puede tratarse de una forma corpórea infinita. entonces la forma corpórea, dado que está limitada, no es aplicable a lo que...
We don't have to go through the rest of it. Some of these are, that actuality precedes potentiality, that's okay. All right, so okay, so now you have the Near Eastern, the Church Fathers, and Origen is particularly interesting here. Adopting these categories, this is their intellectual moment, right? What is our intellectual moment? If you want to be a theologian, you have to deal with Darwinism, you have to deal with Big Bang cosmology, you have to make your theology fit in your intellectual moment. So yogis have to deal with more modern psychologies and notions of the mind and the whole discussion of the hard problem of consciousness. So this is our intellectual moment. Their intellectual environment was Platonic Aristotelian. So these are the presumptions, philosophical presumptions, and there's nothing in the Old Testament that suggests that God's form is not material. It seems to be material. There's nothing that says, unlike the Indian script, that they're going to say that form, that Krishna's form, Vishnu's form is made of condensed consciousness, non-matter. But let's not jump to the end of the story. So therefore, you have to now deal. Okay, now you have to. You're going to have conversations with the literati and the educated urban elites. You're going to have jettison notions of your God, your biblical God, having a form. Right. But what are you going to do? Are you going to throw out the Bible? You can't jettison the Bible and still be a believer. So you've got to figure out, what are we going to do? Right, you want to be a Jew, you want to be a Christian, so you have to, you can't start cutting bits out of the Bible. So what are you going to do with the clearly anthropomorphic statements of the Bible on the one hand, while you've adopted these Greco anti-form, antibody presuppositions of the great Greek philosophers? How are you going to reconcile this dilemma?
Entonces, si uno es un teólogo actualmente, tiene que enfrentarse a su momento intelectual, que es post-darwinista, post-teoría del Big Bang, y debe de alguna manera adaptar su teología a las teorías post-darwinistas y post-Big Bang. Debe entrar en diálogo con la élite intelectual urbana de su tiempo y hacer inteligible su teología para esa comunidad intelectual. De la misma manera, los yogis en la actualidad tienen que entrar en diálogo con la psicología moderna para poder, de alguna manera, justificar su teoría de yoga. En la antigüedad, Diógenes establece a un pensador paradigmático en este sentido. La élite intelectual y urbana con la cual entraban en diálogo los teólogos era de un neoplatónico aristotélico principalmente. Entonces, los supuestos filosóficos son los que enumeró brevemente Edwin anteriormente, que tenían esa visión contraria anti la concepción divina con una forma corpórea. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que pueden hacer estos pensadores, estos teólogos, con los elementos antropomórficos de la Biblia, que además no parecen negar en ningún lado el Antiguo Testamento que Dios efectivamente sea material o tenga una forma corpórea? Entonces, ¿cómo pueden reconciliar estos aspectos del antropomorfismo bíblico con el forma intelectual?
So then the solution to this problem then is provided, as far as I can tell. It's not Philo who starts this actually. It's the Xenophanes, as far as we know, who starts to apply. Plato and Aristotle still accept the gods, by the way, but what they're uncomfortable with are the gods of Homer, the epics, who seem to be very immoral, sort of, they have affairs with other people's wives and so on. But anyway, that's another separate story. But Philo he's not the first, but he's the first in the Abrahamic tradition to, and what's his date? CE, right? BCE.
Born some years before
Jesus, he overlapped. Yeah. He doesn't meet you, but he overlapped. They say he got sent from. Overlapped. So he then begins with the allegorical, he develops his allegorical methodology of interpretation. So all of the anthropomorphic statements then can be, Philo then proposes that any intelligent and reasonable person it'll be obvious, right? Because he's highly philosophically trained in Greek philosophy. Remember this, all these theologians, why are they theologians? Because they're very highly trained in philosophy. That's what a theologian is. If you want to be a theologian in any day and age, you have to be highly erudite and educated in your intellectual tradition. But that's why they're theologians and not just, Christian knocking on doors and preaching the message. So Philo then develops this, he gets it from some of the Greeks. So he doesn't, invent the method. So wherever there are anthropomorphic statements, these are not to be taken literally by any intelligent, rational person. So when God sees, it doesn't mean you have eyeballs, it just means that vision is universal. And you get these sometimes highly contrived allegorical interpretations. And of course, what this really means is that, of course, nowhere in the Bible does it say that this is your. Why doesn't it say somewhere in the Bible? Either way, wherever there are anthropomorphic statements, you should be reading them allegorically. Why does it not say that anywhere in the Bible? So this is going to cause some tension, and that tension plays out for centuries. And there are going to be Christian theologians that are uncomfortable to submitting revelation to human reason. You're placing revelation secondary to human reason, and this tension is going to play out right into the present day. Because you're saying what the Bible says, do not take it as literally true. Use your human reason and your God-given intelligence to interpret it. You can see that this is going to be highly problematic. It was highly problematic for centuries of Christians. And you had the big anthropomorphite controversy that, again, Origen was a major player in so many different things. Like, he's my hero, by the way, right? He's a very cool guy. Mostly because he became a heretic, so that's cool. The rebel.
Entonces, una solución a este problema es, en primer momento, lo introduce Filón de Alejandría con su lectura alegórica de estos pasajes antropomórficos de la Biblia. La lectura antropomórfica, lectura alegórica, Filón la toma claramente de los pensadores griegos antiguos, no es él quien comienza la tradición alegórica, pero sí quien introduce la lectura alegórica en la tradición abrahámica, en la lectura de la Biblia. Entonces, un teólogo como era Filón es tal porque está altamente entrenado y es un erudito en la tradición intelectual de su época. La tradición intelectual de su época luce toda la tradición alegórica que ella había leído alegóricamente a Homero o Hesíodo, etc. Y eso es lo que hace que un teólogo sea un teólogo, no solamente un practicante que va y golpea puertas de las casas para hablar acerca de la vida. Entonces, Filón propone en unos casos interpretaciones alegóricas medio tirada de los pelos, ¿sí? Y propone en alguna medida subordinar la revelación a la razón, porque explica que no hay que tomar a la Biblia de manera literal, sino que hay que recibir la Biblia a través del lente de la racionalidad. Y esto incluso hasta la actualidad produce en las corrientes teológicas una discusión porque no todos los teólogos consideran que la teología o la revelación tiene que estar coordinada a la razón, sino por el contrario, que la revelación debe informar a la razón.
Okay, so let me just jump forward, and I don't know how much time you want me to. This is a huge journey. Let me just jump forward, and we'll jump back, and I'll maybe wrap this up in 20 minutes, because I don't want to sort of with too much. I don't know how interesting this is, but anyway, nowhere, likewise. You have 400,000 verses in the Puranas. This is where the stories in India of Shiva and Vishnu and Krishna, a genre of text called the Puranas, 400,000 verses. And then you have the 100,000 verse Mahabharata epic, and then you have the Ramayana, so that's 500,000 verses. And then you have millions and millions and millions of commentary after commentary after commentary. Nowhere in any of that does it say that Shiva and Vishnu and Krishna are metaphors or similes or mythological, which is another highly problematic, condescending, colonializing way of thinking of Indian deities. So the similar situation, but much less discomfort with this, for reasons we'll get to in the Indian tradition. It's just assumed that for God to be perfect and unlimited, God must have a form, for reasons that we will share with you. A couple more minutes on the sort of genealogy of anti-form theologies, and then we'll say something about why, certainly from a Vaishnava perspective, why God must have a form if God is to be perfect. So we'll just sort of save that for, just a few more comments about we started off talking about monism and the prioritization of monism, so we'll just say something about that, and then we'll jump to the Indian point of view.
Entonces, Edwin nos adelanta un poco lo que vamos a hacer en la última sección de la charla y comenta que en ningún lugar dentro de la tradición cultural del hinduismo, que incluye 400.000 versos de los Puranas, que es un género de textos, o los 100.000 versos del Mahabharata, que es una gran obra épica de la India, o ningún lugar de la Ramayana, que trae con otra literatura que se considera épica o cavia antiguo, y esto suma a más de 500.000 de versos. En ningún lugar se afirma que Shiva o Vishnu o Krishna sean simplemente metáforas o símiles o que sean figuras mitológicas, sino que en estos textos se afirma que Dios debe tener una forma corpórea para ser perfecta, en contraposición de esta afirmación de la teología influenciada por la filosofía griega antigua, afirma que la concepción de lo divino como perfecto no puede tener una forma corpórea.
I'm not sure if corporeal is the right term, actually. Just like incarnation is not the correct term, because incarnation is incarnate, and carne is matter, and that is not correct. That's a term that was used by early missionaries, because Christ is an incarnation, because Christ is incarnate, and therefore it was applied to Krishna and so forth by early missionaries, and it stuck. So now you read that that these are incarnations, but that's theologically incorrect. But all of these things have to be fixed, and in order to fix them, we have to trace the genealogies of where they come from, and that's part of the project. So by the 3rd century, then, you still have these huge debates within Christendom. Origen is a major player. Tertullian is still promoting a Stoic notion of a corporeal God, but not a humanoid body, not an anthropomorphic God. There's a difference between an anthropomorphic God and a corporeal God. Because Tertullian's corporeal God is not anthro. It's not anthro in shape. And let's not clutter up our journey. So then by the 3rd, so then the debates sort of seem to die out by the 4th century, and at that point, then it becomes established that the only form is Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, but the God the Father, Yahweh, is it must be, philosophically must be, because it can't be made of matter, remember, presupposition, foundational claim of all form is matter, and God clearly, God cannot have a material form. Also, that's suggested many reasons. Another one is, if God's body is made of matter, then you have a distinction between soul and matter. So you have a dualism. If your body is material, then and this goes back to Plato's notion of let me do wash it. That goes back to Plato's discussion that souls and body are different. So if they're different, they can be separated. So there's so many reasons to then deny God of form. Okay, so by the 4th century, then this becomes a forgotten debate, and then through the centuries, Christian scholars would then go to the seminaries and they would read the church fathers as a matter of kind of historical interest of the early history of the church. The debate was no longer an active, a living debate. So therefore, when missionaries go to India, if they're educated, they would have studied Origen, Tertullian, against the heretics, right? Tertullian's contra something like that. And they would have these presuppositions, even though it's a dead debate. For a millennia in the West, it would be what we call samskaras in Sanskrit. This sort of, they would have been trained to think that any notions of God with form, and by the way, let's not even talk about deities. Let's not even talk about deities. We're not even talking about deities, but that is a huge problem, right? Thou shalt not worship the graven image. Let's just bracket that for another book. We're talking about just God with form. So, of course, when they come to India and they encounter the Vaishnavas, and they're going to project all of this, what they studied in seminary about how the form theologies were primitive and mythological, and you had this whole thing of logos and mythos, and they're going to project all that whole history, they're going to project it onto what they encountered in India. Okay? Are we comfortable with that? Projecting an entire cultural, philosophical history onto a completely different philosophical, cultural landscape, or we'll just leave that question dangling. And then we'll get to why Indians have a very different understanding of God and form.
Este debate se extiende hasta el siglo III después de Cristo, y ya para el siglo IV después de Cristo está prácticamente establecido que la única forma corpórea de lo divino es Jesucristo, pero que Dios Padre no puede tener una forma corpórea porque cualquier forma corpórea implica materia. Y ya para el siglo IV esto queda establecido y el debate se diluye porque ha quedado establecido esto. Pero a lo largo de los siglos, los religiosos, si tenían una formación, estudiaban a los padres de la Iglesia temprano y estudiaban este debate como su formación histórica intelectual, y 1000 años después del siglo IV, cuando los misioneros llegan a India, dado que habían sido educados y entrenados en esa tradición intelectual e histórica, encuentran en la India, o por dicho, interpretan lo que encuentran en la India, con estos presupuestos de los que antes hablaba Edwin. Edwin recurre al concepto de samskara, propio de la India, que lo podemos decir como impresiones que tenemos justamente a partir de nuestras experiencias, incluso las experiencias teóricas intelectuales. Entonces se lee a la India, estos misioneros leen a la India con esos samskaras, con esos presupuestos, y encuentran muy problemática la noción de Dios con forma corpórea, tal como propia de Shiva, de Vishnu, de Krishna, y no hablemos de cómo los misioneros reaccionan frente a la adoración que el hinduismo tiene muy difundida de lo que desde la perspectiva de los misioneros serían los ídolos o las imágenes. Porque desde la perspectiva misionera se estaba adorando a una imagen, mientras que desde la perspectiva teológica las perspectivas teológicas del hinduismo, eso no es una imagen ni un símbolo ni un ídolo, sino que es la deidad que es adorada porque la deidad ingresa en esa imagen o ídolo por su gracia.
Well, let's talk about the theology of governance. Sorry. Yeah, by the way, that's how you know I'm Italian. I move my hands and not think over. That's proof of Italian genes. Not British genes, but so sorry. But that's it. That's we're not talking about deities, okay? It's talking about the Godhead with form. So you know, the first missionaries thought, okay, well, the Hindus are lovely, gentle, pious people, but Satan has bewildered them in the form of with form, and they're all going to hell. And therefore, the missionaries, you know, I have to say, I used to really think these missionaries are rather unpleasant and ignorant people. But I actually changed my mind a lot on that. I do think there was ignorance, and when I say ignorant, I mean ignorance of Indian theology. But when you read the missionary accounts, they were really sincere, pious people. They were going to leper colonies, which high caste Brahmins would not go to. They just believed. They believed, deeply believed, that if you worshipped a god with form, you were going to go to hell. And they wanted to save. They were actually compassionate, kind. They were just monitored by their theological boxes, their theological lenses. They actually thought these people are going to hell and we have to save them. So there was a lot of kindness and compassion, but ignorance of the theology of Hinduism in the early days. As as time went by, there was an increasing awareness of the sophistication of Indian philosophy, but again, the philosophies associated with Hindu, with the monotheistic traditions, where God has a form, were marginalized. They were sort of bracketed. But there was an increasing awareness of sophistication of Indian thought, an increasing awareness of respect, and less discourse of going to hell, right? That would have been the early, Portuguese. And so there were various phases of missionary sort of reactions to the theologies they were encountering, but two things were standard. Two things were retained from our point of view. One is a disinterest, complete ignoring of the form theologies, and those are the monotheistic traditions. So if you bypass the monotheistic traditions, what are you left with? Monistic traditions. So the monistic traditions then get sort of presented as rational, sophisticated, and the real Hinduism, and the form monotheistic traditions then as sort of rustic, very similar to what was going on in the Near East, right? So then you have, and then this sort of feeds into, and you can document this. You just have to go to a library. We're doing this. We're documenting. But all of the, let's tell me again. With all of these, you have a chart. Introduction to Indian philosophy starts maybe late 1700s, very, very early, 1800s, and then you can just document all the intros to Hindu philosophies right up until present. And quantitatively, you can see what do they consider to be Indian philosophy. And the monotheistic traditions are neglected. You can empirically document that. And the monistic traditions then are presented as sort of rational intellectual Hinduism. And the same story in comparative mysticism. Doing quantitative analysis, starting with William James, of what Indian streams of thought are considered useful to the comparative mysticism project, and they're always the monistic, Advaita, the non-dual, the monistic traditions. Okay, so let's just get that out, and then we'll say something about why the monotheistic tradition will insist that for God to be a perfect being, God must have a form, not that God cannot have a form, but that God must have a form. We'll throw that out there and see what we think, and then we'll know the end. Try not to mock God.
Entonces, desde la perspectiva de los misioneros, cuando llegan a India, consideraban que los hindúes eran personas amorosas y gentiles, pero estaban completamente vidas por el demonio y que iban a ir al infierno. Esto se puede documentar, esta creencia. Y Edwin, inicialmente, en su abordaje, sentía un cierto placer ante la figura de estos misioneros, pero con el tiempo, a través de sus lecturas, se fue percatando de que la motivación de los misioneros era realmente sincera y eran muy piadosos. Incluso los misioneros iban a estar en contacto con personas con lepra, que por ejemplo los mismos brahmanes de la India que han hablado, y ellos realmente y sinceramente creían que, dado que estaban adorando a formas de lo divino o a divinidades por forma, estaban condenados. Y por lo tanto querían salvarlos, y tenían esta perspectiva porque ellos estaban monitoreados por su lente o perspectiva teológica desarrollada durante más de un tiempo. Sin embargo, también estaban atravesados por una ignorancia de la teología hinduista. Y con el tiempo se va cambiando esto, y de hecho uno puede rastrear distintas fases, las reacciones de los misioneros, de los estudiosos, distintos estudiosos de la tradición, de las tradiciones hinduistas a lo largo del tiempo. Y con el tiempo hay cada vez una conciencia mayor de la sofisticación de la filosofía de la India y un mayor respeto. Aún así, persiste un desinterés, una ignorancia generalizada de las teologías de lo divino con forma propia de las tradiciones monoteístas del hinduismo, y quedan en las representaciones intelectuales occidentales de la India aquellas tradiciones monistas como representaciones del verdadero hinduismo, del hinduismo intelectualmente rico y con el cual es fructífero entrar en diálogo. Uno puede rastrear en la literatura que representa desde Occidente al pensamiento de la India a partir de 1800 en adelante, y hacer un estudio cuantitativo de qué tradiciones intelectuales de la India son representadas en esa literatura, y lo que se ve es que las tradiciones monoteístas, son de las que conciben lo divino con forma, son descuidadas, y es justamente el monismo el que considerado como fructífero para ser tomado en cuenta. Lo mismo respecto del misticismo hindú, que es el monismo, la tradición advaita principalmente, la que se toma como útil para el proyecto comparativo. Entonces, vamos a ver ahora qué es lo que dicen estas tradiciones monoteístas respecto de por qué la concepción de lo divino debe incluir.
Okay, before we touch on that, we'll just say that the discussion about whether there's a God in the first place, and that would be the term in Sanskrit, Ishvara. Ishvara means a personal intelligence behind the universe. That's a discussion that goes on since the beginning of Indian philosophy. So you had those who accepted Ishvara, accept kind of intelligent, basically intelligent design arguments. So you had traditions that accepted, the vast majority of traditions accepted that there must be intelligence behind the structure and organization of the universe. So we're not going to deal with that. And then the Buddhists and the Jains, and within the Vedic traditions, the Mimamsa rejected the idea of an Ishvara. Okay, so that's a discussion that we're not interested in, but we're interested in those that, because that discussion never ends. It never ends, right? Either you have an intelligence behind the universe, or you say, why do you need an intelligence? Let the very nature of matter be such that Svabhava, by its own nature, it comes together in the creation of the universe. So that's a discussion that takes place throughout human history, every culture, and will continue to take place for another 2,000 years. So we're bracket that. So in the traditions that do accept Ishvara, God, why is it, first of all, how do you respond to the arguments that we encountered about form? They're coming from the Greeks, and by the way, we find some similar arguments within at least one Indian theistic tradition. That's theistic, it denies God of form. The Nyaya tradition, within the Vaidika, within the Hindu tradition, there's one rationalist actually. They're rationalists, interestingly enough, is the rationalist school. Only they do not quote scripture. They only use reason, and they say there must be intelligence, but that intelligence cannot have a form. So the Platonic, Aristotelian, Greek notion that God can not have a form has a counterpart. And Plato and Aristotle were theists. They were theists, except God. They're monotheists in their own way. So they have a counterpart within Hinduism. We're not going to look at that. That's a whole other thing. We're going to look at the much broader traditions, the Vaishnava and Shaiva traditions. How would they respond to the idea that form is not suitable if God is to be eternal and infinite and so forth?
Hay que señalar que anterior a la pregunta o la discusión de si Dios tiene una forma o no, es la pregunta del problema de si hay Dios. Hay tradiciones, la tradición intelectual india, que rechazan la idea de un Ishvara, que es una inteligencia personal que está detrás del universo, que lo crea, tal como podríamos hablar de la filosofía contemporánea, ciertas ramas de un diseño inteligente. Entonces, por ejemplo, el budismo, el jainismo, dentro de la tradición vaidika, la Vajrayana Mimamsa, ellos rechazan la idea de lo divino. ¿Sí? Entonces, tenemos las tradiciones que lo rechazan y las que lo aceptan, como, por ejemplo, tradiciones Vaishnava y Shaiva. Dentro de estas tradiciones, entonces, que aceptan Vaishnava y Shaiva, y vamos a ver cuál es el argumento, los argumentos, las respuestas que ellas brindan al cuestionamiento de la forma corpórea o de la forma dentro del mismo. Y también hay que señalar que hay una tradición dentro de las tradiciones hinduistas que aceptan Dios, es decir, que no son budismo, jainismo, mimamsa, sino que es la tradición de la escuela Nyaya, que son racionalistas, en la escuela que se conoce como teológica en la India, que ellos hacen a un lado la revelación, las escrituras, sino que reflexionan de manera racional acerca de lo divino y consideran que esta inteligencia que debe existir no puede tener de todos modos una forma. Entonces podríamos, una forma tipo corpórea, antropomórfica, podríamos decir que hay un cierto paralelismo con la tradición platónico-aristotélica dentro de la tradición de la India. Pero vamos a concentrarnos en las tradiciones Vaishnava y Shaiva que defienden la concepción de lo divino.
So first, how do they respond to the arguments? In other words, is it coherent to say God could have a form, number one, and then number two, the tradition, the Vaishnava tradition would say, well, actually, God must have a form. But let's just see how they might respond to the objections. Number one, they would challenge the notion that all form and all bodies are made of matter and compounds. And the forms, the term in Sanskrit is Saguna Brahman, that the forms of Ishvara, the forms of Bhagavan, the forms of God are, one theologian calls it condensed consciousness. Consciousness, I think everybody would accept, right? You can't divide it soul stuff. Consciousness is non-divisible. So that seems to be, any theistic tradition or dualistic tradition or would accept that. So therefore, the Vaishnava traditions would say that God's form is like a soul. The form itself is made of non-divisible, non-reducible, compacted, it's not a very good way of thinking about it, condensed, Jiva Goswami would say, Ghanna Chaitana, it's condensed consciousness, and therefore not separable. So that's one response to the idea, or rather they would challenge the idea that form equals and body equals a material compound. They would just say, well, why? Why do we do not? Why should we sign that? We're not willing to accept that. Why can't there be non-material form? By the way, there were voices like this in the Near East. Not quite sure what happened to them, but there were certainly voices that God did have a form, and that it wasn't material. There are voices; they just didn't seem to make an intellectual impact. So, number one, challenging the assumption, the declaration, the unphilosophically defended presupposition that form is matter. Challenged. But we claim that in our revelations inform us that form can be made of Satchidananda, pure consciousness, compacted in beautiful ways that get to.
Entonces, en primer lugar, tenemos la pregunta de si es coherente que Dios tenga forma, y en segundo lugar, vamos a ver que el Vaishnavismo afirma que Dios debe tener una forma. Y retomando el primer punto, tenemos la objeción de que un cuerpo es igual a ser un compuesto material, y está, por ejemplo, la tradición Vaishnava que desafía esta presuposición de que tener un cuerpo que es ser un cuerpo material, y proponen que la idea, por ejemplo, de Saguna Brahman, que es concebido como conciencia condensada, que no es divisible. Es una forma, pero no es divisible, es conciencia condensada, compacta, no separable en distintas partes. Muy bien, y esta forma es concebida como Satchidananda.
And therefore, there's no soul inside the body, creating a dualism between a spiritual conscious soul and a material body. No, there is no distinction like that. The body is Bhagavan. The soul is manifest in the, not manifest, no, because if you say something manifests, it suggests that there's a pre-manifestation. No, the form is eternal. Consciousness is eternally found in this form. The consciousness of God as a conscious being is eternally found in a form. Why? We'll get to in a second. But all I'm saying now is that is the response to the idea that form is material and compounded and therefore reducible. Point number one.
Entonces, para resumir, esta respuesta afirma que el alma, que es Bhagavan, es su forma corpórea, y rechaza la distinción entre alma y cuerpo, que implica que hay una separación entre los dos, sino que el cuerpo de Bhagavan es ese alma, y no es meramente una manifestación.
Point number two, you could say, okay, we'll accept that. Well, for argument's sake, let's have a thought experiment. Okay, well, let's say we consider that, but that's still a limitation. You're still spatially bound because, okay, whatever this condensed consciousness is, let's say, okay, consciousness can be eternally condensed into this form, but it's still here, not there. The form is still limited, right? It's still like in one place but not another. And the response to that is twofold. One, the simile of the sun is often given. That the sun maybe is condensed heat and light on the one hand, you can consider it to be spatially situated, but is also infinitely present. And therefore the heat, the Shakti is the term in Sanskrit. The Shakti of the sun is infinite, but the Shakti is kind of lesser in, the heat of the sunlight and the luminosity of the sunlight is the same as that in the sun, but less. And so therefore, so that's like as the sun is condensed luminosity and caloric energy, so the form of God is condensed consciousness, but that consciousness can still pervade the universe. Point number one. And number two, the forms are unlimited. And many of the stories of the famous story of Krishna when he dances with the gopis, well, each gopi has her own Krishna. So therefore, there's not just one Krishna, or one Vishnu, or one Narayana. To be so therefore the forms themselves are unlimited. Nothing to do with polytheism. It is a necessary attribute of God that God must have unlimited forms. So this is point number two. And then we'll talk about why. So that hopefully suggests that there's some coherence to the theologies, that there is a response to, let's say, Platonic and Aristotelian assumptions, but it doesn't really. So then we'll talk about why form might be. One might be able to construct an argument as to how form must be a property of a perfect being.
Entonces, en segundo lugar, si aceptamos hipotéticamente que Dios tiene una forma, es una, digamos, línea de pensamiento dentro del hinduismo, si se acepta esto, entonces se plantea el problema de que hay una limitación espacial, porque la forma corpórea implica que hay determinado atributo en un lugar que no está en otro lugar, o que la misma forma está en un lugar y no está en otro lugar. Pero las tradiciones intelectuales, frente a esa objeción, dan una respuesta que incluye un símil del Sol, donde el Sol es luminosidad condensada y en el Sol mismo esa luminosidad está presente, pero también está presente en toda la irradiación de la luz y del calor que emite el Sol. Entonces hay por una parte una condensación, pero por otra parte una presencia que se irradia infinitamente. Y una segunda respuesta es que las formas mismas son ilimitadas. Nos recuerda acá la historia que encontramos en Bhagavad Gita sobre Krishna, que tiene a sus devotas, que son las gopi, y no hay un Krishna para todas las gopi, sino que cada gopi tiene su Krishna. Entonces esto ilustra que las formas mismas de Dios, en este caso Krishna, son ilimitadas.
Okay, and then we'll wrap it up now, and I like to throw this out because everything up to this point we're sifting through the primary sources, Plato, reading Plato, and the Old Testament, and the Church Fathers, and then missionary discourse of it. So we're sifting through the primary text, but at the end we engage in a little bit of constructive theology, but we'll call it constructive philosophy of religion, because some people are afraid of the category of theology. So actually, philosophy of religion really is theology. But anyway, so constructive philosophy of religion. And so here, we the authors now, we borrow Anselm's definition of a perfect being. And of course, Anselm is using his argument in order to prove the existence of God. We're not using it that way, but we are adopting his notion that if there is a God, then that God must be perfect, and there can be nothing. You can't think of anything more perfect than God. So therefore, that God is that being than whom nothing more perfect can be thought. Right? He's trying to establish, prove the existence of God. I look quite how there seems to be something missing. But anyway, obviously that discussion has played out for a few centuries, but we're not using it that way. Well, our argument is going to be, okay, is a beautiful God better than a not beautiful God? Is a God with beauty superior to a God without beauty? Question number one. If you say a beautiful God is better than a not beautiful God, right? Like you say, a God with power, right? Omnipotent. So therefore, an omnipotent God is better than a God who's not omnipotent, or omniscient God is better than a God who's not omniscient, and so forth with the omnis. Well, actually, the Hindus have 6 primary omnis, and one of the primary omnis is omni-beautiful. God must have beauty. And the Sanskrit word for beauty is the same as the word form. And by the way, this is visual beauty. Because in English, you can say beauty, you can say beautiful food, beautiful sound. You can't in Sanskrit. The beauty is rupa. So therefore, our argument is, okay, let's borrow Anselmian categories and suggest that a beautiful God is superior than a not beautiful God. And therefore, if we like that argument, then God must be beautiful. And if God must be beautiful, he must have a form. Then, of course, piggybacking on all this other philosophical, that's just the sort of providing the infrastructure of, rejecting the counter arguments. We have to do all of that first. We have to clear the groundwork. And then the sort of grand finale is that a beautiful God must be. And then if you read the stories of Krishna, for example, which is my own, the text I work with over 45 years, is the Bhagavad Purana. There's just an incessant stress on beauty, 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 beauty. And of course, and you sort of have Lotus Eyes. How do you describe God's beauty? You can't describe it in material categories. So you find the most beautiful thing that the poetic mind can imagine in ancient India, and that was a lotus petal. So that was a substitute for that's sort of our kind of limited attempt at depicting beauty. So the stress on Krishna's beauty, power is there, omniscience is there, but very much in the background of the Krishna theology. It's much more there in the Vishnu theologies. In the Krishna theology, the stress is on Krishna's beautiful form and beautiful eyes and beautiful hair and beautiful all attractive nature. So therefore, sort of we conclude the I guess partly what we do. I'm not sure how to do this. I have to figure out a way of being somehow discreet about this. But one of the things I want to do is say, what if you looked at your Old Testament and challenged the idea that the anthropomorphic God, that form is matter? What if you challenged that? And instead of getting all complicated with all the Platonic categories and dealing with all of this, sort of borrowing all this philosophy from the Greeks, how about you just read the Bible and accept the Bible for what it says and question the assumption that form is necessarily material? What if you were to consider that the God in the and it seems to me this is something that the Eastern monotheism can contribute to the conversation of comparative monotheism. Have you noticed that people think monotheism is only Abrahamic, even to this day? What if we bring Vaishnava monotheism into the conversation and present some of these different presuppositions and different kinds of ways of thinking of God's form? What would that do? And what would that do to then returning to the Bible with a new set of possibilities and looking at the anthropomorphic statements of the Bible? So that's kind of like part of the agenda. But the other is just to also present Krishna and Vishnu and Shiva as claimed revelation. What are you going to do? Just say there's only one revelation? They don't laugh. They laughed at the idea. You think God only had one revelation in one little corner of the world? They laughed at that. When they responded to the Christian missionaries, they thought, how silly. You think the Almighty, you want God to be almighty and infinite? Well, how about the possibility that he reveals in different cultures, different times, and so forth? So, so part of our project is to shake things around a bit. I think that's it.
El trabajo la última parte del trabajo puse una propuesta de teología constructiva o de filosofía de la religión constructiva que retoma en alguna medida el argumento de Anselmo acerca de la existencia de Dios, que busca demostrar efectivamente la existencia de Dios a partir de la estimación de la perfección de Dios. Como Dios es perfecto, no puede dejar de ser de existencia, y por lo tanto, Dios, como ser perfecto y no perfecto, sí, debe ir. Y retomando en alguna medida este argumento, se cuestiona o se plantea esta de la religión constructiva que Dios, su perfección, debe ser bello, por la pregunta de si Dios en su perfección debe ser bello o no. Y en ese caso, si Dios bello es superior a un Dios sin belleza. Tenemos la omnipotencia de Dios, la omnisciencia de Dios como atributos que deben estar presentes, pero en este caso por la belleza, que no puede decir que es necesaria la belleza en un Dios perfecto, o puede decir que sí, que es necesaria la belleza en un Dios perfecto, y de hecho la belleza suprema, la omni, y es el elemento que se retoma en esta propuesta, es que la noción que se expresa la belleza en sánscrito es la misma con la que se expresa forma corpórea, muchas es grupa, y es una forma visual, expresa y se capta visual. Entonces, la respuesta es que si Dios, perfección, tiene que ser belleza máxima, entonces tiene que tener forma corpórea. En esta construcción de la religión o teológica se retoman también las historias de Krishna, donde incesantemente se subraya la belleza de Krishna. También hay atributos de ciencia y de omnipotencia, pero el atributo cual más se enfatiza es la belleza. Y la belleza no puede ser puesta de manifiesto mediante categorías inmateriales, lo que se recurre a cualidades visibles. Como decíamos antes, una de las que más se toma es la del pétalo de loto como un intento limitado de expresar la belleza de Krishna en sus ojos, de su pelo, de su naturaleza. En la conclusión de su trabajo, Edwin propone que se tome la lectura del Antiguo Testamento, por una parte, desafiando el supuesto de que forma corpórea de lo divino implica materialidad, que implica la tradición la griega, no bíblica, y busca contribuir, a su vez, integrar en el diálogo de los monoteísmos a los monoteísmos del hinduismo, porque tal, cuando se ponen en diálogo los monoteísmos, son los monoteísmos abrámicos, y no suelen entrar en ese diálogo los monoteísmos hinduistas, como por ejemplo el vaishnavismo. Entonces, se propone que este análisis del monoteísmo vaishnavismo, Vaishnava, enriquezca a su vez la reflexión intelectual de los monoteísmos abrámicos y de la lectura del Antiguo Testamento.
Yeah, because early missionaries, when they saw the idea of the infinite forms, they assumed it's quality, but it's not. It's like Trinitarianism, but instead of Trinitarianism, it's a multiplicity. Why three? Three is a bit of a small number. About God having an infinity of forms, but it's not polytheism. Polytheism and the forms are all independent. This is there is one causal source or origin form that can manifest an infinity of that can manifest an infinity. Monotheistic in the sense of one causal original form. just as Christianity would say, okay, it's got the Father, Catholics should be able to understand it. Unitarians would say Catholics are polytheists. The Catholics can still defend the idea that God the Father, it manifests God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. So why not extend that to infinity if God is infinite? And say there must be, not there could be, there must be an infinity of form for God. How about that?
Entonces, los cuando llegan a la India y ven estas infinitas formas, lo divino, lo representan como un politeísmo, pero no se trata de un politeísmo, porque en un politeísmo las formas son independientes, pero en esta teología se trata de una forma causal principal, y luego una infinidad de formas conectadas con esa primera forma causal, son manifestaciones de ella y que son infinitas. Entonces, si Dios es infinito, no solo es posible que tenga la forma, sino que debe tener infinitas formas.
Okay, well, we'll open it up and, let me be provocative. And that is, if you're a Christian theologian, there is no philosophical argument that you can raise against Vaishnava monarchy. The only thing you can do, say, well, our revelation is true and yours is not. Do we really want to do that? That's the question. Because there's no philosophically, right? You can't prove it, but you can defend the position. It's like Christian theologians can defend the Trinity. You can spend 2,000 years theologizing. So as you can defend the Trinitarian notion, as Unitarians have their theological infrastructure to defend that, you cannot philosophically rebut a Vaishnava monarchy. So then if you are a Christian theologian, your options are simply to accept the possibility that God can manifest in different cultures, you accept that possibility, or you take a position that our revelation is true and yours is not. Take your pick. Or present some other option.
Entonces, si uno se plantea la cuestión provocativa de si uno es un teólogo cristiano, no habría argumentos filosóficos en contra del monoteísmo Vaishnava. La teología, una de las tradiciones, puede verdaderamente probar su función, pero sí puede defenderla. Y si uno fuera un teólogo cristiano, tiene la posibilidad de, o bien, aceptar que Dios puede manifestar en múltiples veces, en múltiples formas, en distintas culturas, y que manifiesta esto en las distintas revelaciones, o le queda la otra opción de considerar que hay sola una revelación que es verdadera, y la otra no, y eso también tomarlo a priori. ¿Cuál es la opción que nosotros estamos buscando? O tal vez haya otra tercera opción que lo vamos a tomar en cuenta.
Yes.
Muchas gracias a Edwin y abrimos el espacio para preguntas. Bien.
No.
Oh, well.
Because you were very, very clear about a previous question that I have about Esta. You were very clear about it.
Can I make a question?
Yes.
Just to
Yes. Yes.
No,
We
we were contrasting monism and monotheism.
Yeah.
And let's maybe degree limit the question and the answer to Hinduism. How would you say that the personal response of a practitioner would vary from a monist and a monotheistic people?
Well, remember, on the grass, that diálogo.
No, I'm
philosophical, diálogo.
I'm asking in terms of personal relationship with God. So, is there a difference between personal relationship with God of a monist and the personal relationship with God of a monotheistic, like for an Advaita Vedantin or Vaishnava?
Yeah.
What would be the
The difference would be that the difference would be for the Advaita that devotion is ultimately illusory. It's temporary. It's just a method. It's just you're trapped in this world of Maya and you have to get out. So you have to use a method. And so within the world of imagination, within the world of Maya, you temporarily accept that there's a God, and you temporarily accept that you're an individual soul, and you temporarily accept that there's this bhakti relationship, but intellectually you know that that's just a method, and then ultimately it'll dissolve in the Brahman, that there's formless, qualityless, heartless Brahman. So that would be going on in the mind of a real Vedantin, but in the mind of common folks, no, there would be no difference. They would have genuine piety. All of this is theological, collectively astute.
and the Vaishnava?
Would be understanding that it's eternal and would be hoping to develop and continue that relationship in the kingdom of God, Saguna Brahman. So the bhakti in this, the devotion in this world is preparatory for eternal devotion between the soul and the distinct Godhead in the personalist realm of Brahman. Quite different. But again, those are the intellectually, just like Christians. How many Christians are reading Oregon or whatever? Christians are pious, they love Jesus, and they're not going to get involved in this theological controversy.
Mi pregunta apuntaba a la diferencia no ya teológica, sino a las distintas respuestas personales que se tienen a esas teologías, ¿no? Como un teólogo monista se vincula con lo divino, tal como lo concibe, y como un teólogo monoteísta se vincula con lo divino, tal como lo concibe. Entonces, ten en cuenta que un filósofo de la Advaita Vedanta concibe que la devoción es...
They know what Advaita Vedanta is.
La Advaita Vedanta es una de las tradiciones, la tradición clave no dualista, ¿sí? Antes monística. Edwin hablaba del monismo en contraposición al monoteísmo, donde el monoteísmo implica una concepción de lo divino con forma, y el monismo o no dualismo de la Advaita implica una concepción de lo divino sin forma. Entonces, para un Advaita Vedantin, la devoción, que implica una relación con lo divino, es, en último término, una ilusión, porque el alma individual o el atman individual es una ilusión. Bhagavan, como forma de lo divino, es eventualmente también una ilusión, porque la única realidad es el atman, es el absoluto, lo divino absoluto, ¿sí? Aún así, dentro de esta ilusión, hay dualidad dentro de la ilusión, entonces la devoción es considerada como un método que eventualmente tiene que ser abandonado, ¿sí? Es un método que implica una distinción entre Dios con el atman individual y una relación entre ellos. Pero como no hay verdadera distinción entre Dios y el alma individual, porque aún es el atman, entonces esta relación también es ilusoria, por lo tanto es meramente un método que eventualmente se tiene que ser hablado. Para un monoteísta como un Vaishnava, por el contrario, la devoción es la finalidad de su práctica, porque la relación entre Dios y el Atman individual es eterna, porque Dios es eterno con sus cualidades y el Atman individual, o digamos, el alma individual también es eterno. Por lo tanto, la relación entre ellos dos puede ser eterna, y la devoción que se practica en este mundo es preparatoria para la relación eterna que el alma puede entablar con Dios, con forma, en otro plano y en forma de eternidad.
Yeah, you know, there's monotheisms in India that are very different from the Abrahamic. I mean, monism is different. The Advaita Vedanta is different from the China. China's the world is real, some to extent. But in the Advaita Vedanta, it's totally unreal. So the monisms are different, and you know, we have been very myopic still. In my Rutgers University has the best philosophy department in, they claim, I'm not sure if they claim in the world or in America, but between NYU and Rutgers University, sometimes NYU is number one and Rutgers is number two, vice versa. And there is no, there's still this Euro myopia that has outlived its shelf life. And slowly, Western philosophy departments are waking up to the idea that there is philosophy outside of Europe. And I'm suggesting there are monotheisms and sophisticated theology. And so, you know, I always tell my students, this is a good time to get into Hindu philosophy, because departments are realizing this cannot continue. And now you're getting more, it's a good time to be trained in Indian philosophy, because philosophy departments are opening their gates and having at least a token, non-Western, we start with a token, and slowly. So we'll see this in our own academic, you know, those of you that, I don't know if there's students here, this is a good time to get some Indian philosophy on its CV, because that will make you very attractive. I don't know about you in Israel, but certainly in America, if you learn Greco, you learn Greek, but if you can do some solid Indian philosophy, you'll be attracted, because reason. We can't just keep, you know, our blinkers on and thinking that the rest of the world hasn't produced philosophy, or, right, what to speak of monotheism. First open the door to Indian philosophy, and then maybe, you know, and then piggybacking on that, we're going to get much more engagement and encounter, and our presuppositions are going to be challenged by monotheism. So I think it's a bright future, and if someone is a philosopher, it should be exciting. If someone's a theologian, it should be exciting, my friends. Same God, why isn't that exciting? See how God manifests in different positions. Wouldn't that be exciting if you're a God seeker? And if you're not, and you're a philosopher, then non-Western atheism might be of interest to you. So it's all good.
Teniendo en cuenta que en su universidad, Rutgers, hay un excelente departamento de filosofía que afirma ser mejor de Estados Unidos y compite con el departamento de filosofía de la Universidad de New York, y a veces es uno el primero y a veces es otro, pero en Rutgers, el departamento de filosofía no hay nadie enseñando filosofía de la India.
Not like 5 members, but I don't know the number, but it's 67 huge faculty.
Es un enorme departamento de filosofía con más de 50 integrantes, pero no hay nadie enseñando filosofía de la India. Entonces, Edwin dice, hemos sido muy miopes en general, creer que solo había filosofía en Occidente y en no aceptar que hay filosofía fuera de Occidente. Entonces sugiere a los estudiantes de filosofía, si hay acá algunos presentes, de enriquecer su currículum con una formación sólida en filosofía de la India, porque eso va a volver atractivos para el campo laboral de la enseñanza en filosofía. Y así como debe haber una apertura en la investigación y en la enseñanza de filosofía hacia las filosofías no occidentales, Edwin propone que haya también una apertura hacia los monoteísmos no occidentales y hacia la aceptación de que hay unas construcciones teológicas y filosóficas sofisticadas en India, más allá de las construcciones no indias. Una pregunta, alguien que quiera hacer un comentario. Sí. Bueno, María y después Martín.
En español, ¿sí le traduce?
Sí.
Bueno, hablo sobre esta primera llegada de los misioneros a la India con este preconcepto que ya traía de toda la filosofía griega y cómo se hace ese contraste de dos conocimientos. Mi pregunta es, porque hay referencia de él, y quiero saber la que él haya encontrado, sobre un contacto anterior que se hubiera dado entre la filosofía griega, antes de llegar a los misioneros, y la filosofía de la época, de esa época en la India, ¿no? Si ya había habido un contacto de ciertas, pero se encuentra alguna interesante entre el materialista y el patrón.
You talked about the contact between missionaries and the Indian philosophers or Indian culture. In the 17th century. But Maya asks about previous contact between Greek philosophers and Indian philosophers